Under the muted sunlight of a late spring afternoon, Jason Cooper stepped out into his backyard, holding a cup of black coffee in one hand and a worn tape measure in the other. The smell of fresh-cut wood still lingered faintly in the air, a remnant of the work he had finished just 3 days prior. The backyard had transformed over the past 6 weeks from an empty, dry patch of grass into a functional, thoughtfully designed retreat. A rectangular pool now lay at the center, flanked by gray stone tiles and edged with a low-maintenance landscape of gravel, drought-resistant plants, and precisely placed lighting fixtures. But what stood out most, and what had taken Jason the most time and thought, was the transparent tempered glass fence that surrounded the pool. It was minimalistic yet secure, clean but not sterile. It didn't just meet safety standards, it exceeded them. And it reflected, in a quiet way, the kind of life Jason had always tried to build. Deliberate, functional, unobtrusively refined. This was his space now. After nearly 20 years working in field operations and eventually starting his own small business in water systems installation, Jason had reached a point where he wanted something more stable. Not retirement, he wasn't that old, but a foundation, something of his own. After his divorce 4 years ago and the drawn-out process of selling the family house, he wasn't interested in starting from scratch emotionally, but practically speaking, he needed a new chapter. This new home was in a planned residential community, a quiet, manicured neighborhood just outside the city. The area was well kept, the houses similar but not identical, and the price was right, considering how competitive the market had been. Most of the residents were older, long-time homeowners who spent their weekends gardening or power walking in pairs. That suited Jason fine. He wasn't interested in block parties or community barbecues. He wasn't unfriendly, just private. He nodded politely when passing neighbors but kept his socializing to a minimum, choosing instead to invest in his own comfort. And that began with making this backyard exactly the way he envisioned it. So, when the fence was finally installed, engineered to handle extreme weather, mounted with professional-grade anchors and visually seamless, Jason felt, for the first time in a long time, a subtle but complete sense of control. Not dominance or pride, but control. This fence, he believed, would stand without apology, which is why, when the letter arrived that Tuesday morning, neatly folded into a branded envelope and delivered not through the mail but taped directly to his front door, he felt an immediate sense of intrusion. Not confusion. Intrusion. The envelope was from the community board, marked Notice of Violation, signed at the bottom by one name, Karen Lowry. The letter was composed in formal legalese, the kind meant to sound official but often said very little directly. The offense listed was installation of non-compliant perimeter structure without prior approval. There was no reference to any specific rule or policy number, no warning, no invitation to discuss the issue. Just a fine, a monetary penalty due within 14 days, and a threat of compounding fees if unaddressed. Jason read the letter twice, then set it down on the kitchen counter. His initial reaction wasn't anger, it was calculation. He poured another half cup of coffee, then went to his office and retrieved the binder where he had kept all permits, invoices, design plans, and local zoning approvals related to the project. Every decision he had made was intentional, legal, and informed by both city code and safety regulations. He had made sure of it. Jason didn't believe in cutting corners. Not with work, not with safety, and especially not with his own property. He had even cross-referenced the most recent version of the Neighborhood Association guidelines before signing off on the final materials. Nowhere in those documents was glass fencing prohibited. In fact, several homes in the development had similar enclosures, though perhaps not with the same level of quality or finish. The difference, it seemed, was not the material, but the personality. Jason had not gone through Karen. He remembered their first, and only, interaction. It had been a brief, cordial exchange in the first month after he moved in. She had approached him while he was unloading tools from the back of his truck and introduced herself as the community liaison. Not president, not director. Liaison. She wore it like a badge. She had asked about his work and complimented his lawn. It all seemed benign. Until, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she asked if he planned on submitting any exterior modifications for review. Jason had told her, truthfully, that any changes would comply with local building codes. She had nodded, and with a tone that carried just enough weight to be memorable, added, "We like to keep things consistent around here." He hadn't thought much of it at the time, interpreting it as generic neighborhood small talk, but looking back now, it struck him more like a warning, or at the very least a preamble to something more controlling. With the letter in hand, Jason composed a brief professional email that evening, addressed to the board's contact address listed on the notice. He requested clarification on which specific guideline had been violated, cited his city-approved permits, and offered to supply all documentation if needed. He didn't ask for an apology. He didn't threaten. He simply gave them the opportunity to correct what he hoped was a bureaucratic mistake. But something in his gut told him it wasn't a mistake at all. It was calculated. Quiet pressure meant to force compliance through inconvenience. 2 days passed before he received a reply. The email was curt, unsigned, and referred him to a link that required login credentials he had never received. It stated plainly that his construction was aesthetic incompatible with the architectural guidelines outlined in Appendix D. No Appendix D was attached. The email ended with a reiteration of the payment deadline. Jason exhaled slowly, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling. He didn't want this fight, but if someone was pulling strings behind the curtain, he wasn't going to roll over. The following Sunday, he took a walk around the neighborhood. Not to spy or confront anyone, but simply to observe. He counted 3 other houses with unconventional fencing, one with wrought iron painted matte black, one with horizontally slatted cedar, and one with aluminum panels designed to resemble frosted glass. None had letters on their doors. In fact, 2 of them had lawn signs praising the neighborhood's modern charm. Jason realized then that this wasn't about the fence. This was about precedent. Someone like Karen, whose power rested entirely on enforcement, couldn't allow someone to sidestep her process and come out unchallenged. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about aesthetics. It was about authority. Hers, specifically. That night, Jason sat by the pool, legs stretched out, a tumbler of scotch resting beside him. The glow of the underwater lights shimmered through the water, casting gentle waves of light across the glass panels. He watched as shadows from the landscaping plants danced across the walls of the enclosure. Everything he had built was exactly how he wanted it. And now someone wanted to dismantle it not because it was wrong, but because they didn't get to approve it. He took a slow sip, then looked toward the back gate. It was closed, locked. But suddenly, that didn't feel like enough. Something had been invited into his space. Not physically, not yet, but ideologically. Karen had sent a message. You live here, but you're not in control. And Jason, without raising his voice or his pulse, knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would never allow anyone to quietly take back what he had built with his own hands. Under a dull, gray morning sky that seemed to mirror his mood, Jason Cooper walked down his driveway to retrieve his mail. He wasn't expecting anything significant, perhaps a utility bill or some lingering promotional junk, but tucked into the bundle of envelopes was a larger, manila-colored document packet marked with red ink. Notice of Compliance Escalation. Final reminder. The lettering was aggressive, almost theatrical. His name was printed in bold across the top, and though there was no return address on the envelope, he already knew the source. As he walked back toward the house, his jaw tightened. This was no longer a mistake or bureaucratic oversight. This was coordinated pressure, and it was escalating fast. Inside, Jason laid the packet out on the kitchen table and methodically flipped through the contents. Unlike the earlier notice, this one included several pages of printed photos, zoomed-in angles of his fence, close-ups of the glass panels, and one wide shot clearly taken from an elevated vantage point. He recognized the perspective immediately. The photo had been taken from the back corner of Karen Lowry's second-story deck. No one else had that view. The accompanying text claimed that his unauthorized installation violated not only the supposed Appendix D architectural guideline, but also community sightline uniformity, a phrase that sounded invented on the spot. A new penalty was listed, tripled from the original fine, and noted as accruing interest daily. There was now a threat of formal legal action and a record of non-compliance that, the document warned, could impact the resale value of his property. Jason stared at the papers for a long moment, then walked to his office and called his attorney. He hadn't wanted to involve legal counsel this early, but he also knew that ignoring these tactics would only embolden them. His lawyer, Martin Blake, had worked with him before on business contracts and zoning consultations, and was a man Jason trusted for his sharp analysis and calm disposition. Martin listened as Jason read aloud from the notice and gave a low whistle when Jason described the attached photographs. "So they're spying now," Martin said flatly, "and charging you for the privilege." Jason asked what his next move should be. Martin said he would start by drafting a formal response letter demanding a copy of the specific rule being cited and clarification of the board's voting procedures. "You're not just a target," he added. "You're a precedent they're trying to set. If they get you to fold, they'll have carte blanche." While Martin handled the legal pushback, Jason returned to focusing on his work and routines, trying not to let the undercurrent of conflict infect every corner of his life. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. That week, he noticed two new things. First, a series of anonymous complaints had been submitted to the community management email, accusing him of conducting commercial work on residential property, clearly a dig at the delivery of construction materials during his fence installation. Second, and more troubling, the tone of his neighbors had shifted. A few people who had previously exchanged nods or pleasantries now looked through him. One neighbor, an older man who often watered his garden near the sidewalk, walked away mid-hose the moment Jason appeared. Another visibly crossed to the opposite side of the street while walking their dog. He wasn't being harassed, not outright, but a silent, chilling divide was forming. The final straw came on a Sunday evening as Jason was locking up the backyard gate. A low, scraping sound caught his attention, followed by a muffled thump. He turned toward the front yard just in time to see a folded paper sail across his lawn and land in his flower bed. By the time he reached it, the thrower, someone in a gray SUV, was already rounding the corner. The paper was a homemade flyer, bold block letters reading, "Rules apply to everyone," with a grainy printout of Jason's fence attached beneath. There was no signature, just a vague message that was less a protest and more a provocation. Jason stood there a moment longer than necessary, his breath steady, his fists clenched just enough to feel his own resistance. He wasn't paranoid. This wasn't his imagination. Someone had decided he didn't belong, not because of what he did, but because he didn't submit. He had built his property without their nod of approval. He hadn't sought permission, and in a place where control passed hands in whispers and signatures, that made him dangerous. The next day, Jason received an email from Karen herself. Unlike the prior correspondence, which came through generic channels or unsigned notices, this one bore her full name, title, and personal tone. It was friendly on the surface, almost artificially warm, but laced with underlying condescension. "Dear Mr. Cooper," it began, "I hope this message finds you well. I understand there's been some confusion regarding your recent construction project, and I'd like to extend a personal invitation for us to discuss your compliance concerns at the next committee session. I believe with some open-minded dialogue, we can find common ground and avoid unnecessary complications. Best regards, Karen Lowry." The phrase "unnecessary complications" did all the heavy lifting. Jason didn't respond immediately. He forwarded the message to Martin and waited. When Martin called later that evening, he didn't sound surprised. "She's baiting you into a soft admission. If you attend that meeting without representation or without a record of what's discussed, she'll frame it as you admitting guilt. Decline. Politely, if you like, but don't step into that room unless it's to deliver a cease and desist." So Jason declined. His reply was courteous, unemotional, and deliberately brief. He thanked her for the invitation, stated that the matter was being addressed through appropriate legal channels, and that he would await formal documentation of any violations grounded in publicly available regulations. It was a move designed not to escalate, but also not to retreat. 2 days later, while walking the perimeter of his property, Jason noticed something new. A small, discreet yellow flag had been staked into the ground about 12 inches from the edge of his side yard, near the fence line. It bore the initials PRZ in black ink. He'd seen similar markers used by surveyors or utility workers to denote underground pipes or potential easements. But Jason hadn't authorized any survey work, nor had he seen any workers. He checked the public notification board on the community website. No postings, no notices. It had been placed quietly and without explanation. Jason documented the flag, took photos from several angles, and sent them to Martin. He also knocked on the door of his immediate neighbor, Greg, a retired Air Force mechanic who mostly kept to himself. Greg, ever practical, shrugged when shown the photos. "You didn't call a locator?" Jason shook his head. "Then someone's checking boundaries, probably at her request. You might want to watch your lines. If she tries to say your fence encroaches, it's her way of forcing a tear down." That night, Jason barely slept. He wasn't worried in the dramatic sense, not afraid, but his mind wouldn't settle. He was cycling through timelines, emails, property plans. He knew his measurements were correct, but he also knew how bureaucracies worked. When someone with influence wanted to make your life difficult, they didn't need truth. They just needed confusion. Enough of it, and they could erode your footing until you were the one playing defense. The following morning, Jason scheduled a professional boundary survey, not in response to the flag, but as a preemptive shield. The surveyor arrived a week later, spent 2 hours taking readings, then confirmed that Jason's fence was well within the legal property line. Not only that, but the rear community fence, maintained by Karen's committee, actually overlapped onto Jason's lot by 6 inches in one corner. It was minor, but ironic. He had never mentioned it, and he didn't intend to. Not yet. Meanwhile, Martin had unearthed another detail. The so-called Appendix D cited in the violation notices wasn't included in the publicly published regulations of the neighborhood charter. It was a draft. Never voted into policy, never filed with the registrar. A ghost rule. Which meant the entire case against Jason's fence had no legal standing. It was pressure masquerading as law. And just like that, Jason understood the full scope of what he was dealing with. Karen wasn't trying to protect the neighborhood. She was trying to enforce obedience, to punish him for acting without her blessing. And she was using the very framework of community organization, letters, notices, whispers, to do it. But what she hadn't counted on was that Jason, beneath his quiet and orderly exterior, didn't yield to false authority. Not now, not ever. Jason had anticipated resistance. He had expected more letters, perhaps the slow grind of administrative inconvenience. What he hadn't expected, however, was how quickly and aggressively the tactics would shift from passive pressure to open hostility. The week after his property survey confirmed his fence was entirely within bounds, and his lawyer's formal letter invalidated the supposed violation based on the non-existent Appendix D, Jason received another notice. This one not a fine, but an accusation. The envelope was bulkier, and inside was a formal complaint stating that Jason had violated community operational codes by conducting unauthorized construction with potential environmental impact. This time, the letter cited erosion risk, drainage disruption, and something referred to as aesthetic contamination of shared sightlines. It would have been laughable if not for the fact that the complaint had been filed with the local zoning liaison as well. Someone, presumably Karen, had taken the matter outside the neighborhood's administrative structure and was now trying to involve municipal oversight. Martin, ever composed but now clearly irritated, handled the response. He provided the survey results, permits, and photographic evidence, but added a sharp note in the correspondence. A reminder that frivolous complaints made in bad faith can result in liability for harassment or defamation. Jason suspected Karen wouldn't care. This wasn't about legal accuracy, it was about escalation. And sure enough, the pressure kept building. 3 days later, a pair of municipal workers arrived at Jason's door, one holding a clipboard and the other wearing a yellow vest. They were polite, informed him that they were conducting a routine inspection following a citizen complaint, and asked if they could examine his backyard drainage system. Jason didn't resist. He walked them through the yard, explained how the drainage sloped naturally toward the rear alley, and showed them the permit numbers etched into the side of the installed piping system. The younger of the two workers raised his eyebrows and nodded. "You're good," he said, making a quick note. "Honestly, we've seen a lot worse. But when someone flags it officially, we have to follow up." Jason asked who had submitted the complaint. They shook their heads in unison. "We're not allowed to say. Privacy laws. But you can probably guess." That evening, Jason sat in his office with the blinds partially drawn. The silence of his house, once a source of calm, had turned stale. It wasn't fear he felt, but exhaustion, the kind of pressure that accumulates not in bursts, but in unrelenting weight. He knew the tactics being used against him. Isolate, accuse, smear. It was a strategy as old as politics. Make someone look like a troublemaker, and eventually people will believe the lie, just to avoid the discomfort of questioning it. He pulled up his calendar, marked the date of the zoning inspection, and then, as a matter of principle, not retaliation, logged a quiet report with the county ombudsman's office. He didn't name Karen. He didn't include speculation. He simply noted a pattern of nuisance complaints stemming from unverifiable internal documents, and attached a copy of the original survey along with the lawyer's response. The following weekend, the first real confrontation occurred. Jason was in his driveway changing out a valve on his irrigation timer when he noticed Karen approaching from the sidewalk. She was dressed in her usual beige ensemble, clipboard in hand, phone at the ready. Not recording, just holding it the way some people do when they want you to know they might start at any second. She didn't greet him. She didn't smile. She stood just outside the edge of his driveway and cleared her throat. "Mr. Cooper," she said formally, "you've received multiple notices and have failed to attend 2 community compliance sessions. That behavior is being noted for the record. We're moving forward with formal censure." Jason wiped his hands on a rag, stood, and said nothing. She continued. "We also received several safety concerns about your glass fencing. Children walk along this street. There's been a petition." Jason looked past her, scanning the street. It was mid-afternoon. No children, no petitioners, just Karen and her clipboard. "Safety concerns," he repeated. "From who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped slightly forward and pointed to the base of his fence where it met the stone decking. "This edge here reflects sunlight in a way that could be disorienting to pedestrians. It's been flagged." Jason nodded slowly. "By you?" Her jaw stiffened. "By concerned residents," she corrected with a tone soaked in bureaucracy. He took a step forward, careful not to cross onto the sidewalk. "Karen, let me be clear. You've already submitted false documentation to justify penalties. You filed an anonymous zoning complaint based on invented environmental threats. You're stalking my fence line like a wildlife ranger. And now you're making up optical hazards? I don't know what kind of authority you think you have, but unless you're representing the county, we're done here." Her face didn't change, but her voice dropped. "I'd advise you to be careful with your tone, Mr. Cooper. Defiance can have consequences." That word, defiance, hung in the air like static. Jason didn't respond. He turned, walked back to his tools, and resumed his work. Not out of dismissiveness, but because responding further would have given her exactly what she wanted: the illusion of power. Karen left a minute later, scribbling something onto her clipboard as she walked away. But the fallout came faster than he expected. That Monday, Jason received a letter stating that he was being denied access to the community's shared facilities due to pending compliance violations. He didn't use the clubhouse or the fitness center. But the message was symbolic. He was being cut out, blacklisted. That evening, when he pulled into his driveway, he saw a new sign had been erected near the neighborhood entrance. It featured a generic message about community integrity and maintaining standards. But someone had spray-painted the words, "No exceptions," in red across the bottom. It wasn't clear if Karen had done it herself or just allowed it to remain. Either way, the signal was clear. The pressure was now being institutionalized. Jason, sensing where things were headed, doubled down. Not with confrontation, but with documentation. He began tracking every piece of communication, photographing every new sign, logging dates and interactions. He had Martin submit a public records request for past architectural complaints filed by Karen's committee over the previous 2 years. The results were telling. Nearly 80% of all fines and citations were issued to residents who had made exterior changes without submitting a pre-approval form. Not necessarily illegal changes, just unapproved. And in each case, the form template had been updated multiple times without informing homeowners. One name popped up more than once: Sylvia Herrera, a longtime resident whose home had once been featured in a local design magazine. Jason visited her unannounced, politely knocked, and introduced himself. Sylvia, perhaps expecting a pitch or a complaint, was initially reserved. But when Jason mentioned the name Karen, her demeanor shifted. "That woman made my life hell for 6 months," she said flatly. "All because I added solar shades to my upstairs windows." She said it disrupted the visual unity of the facade. Jason asked what happened. "I appealed. They stalled. I hired a mediator. They backed off. But she never let it go." Sylvia paused, glanced toward her own fence line. "You know what it really was? I didn't ask her first. That's her whole game. She doesn't care what you build. She cares if you build it without kissing the ring." Armed with confirmation of the pattern, Jason and Martin prepared a formal complaint to the County Oversight Board, outlining abuse of authority, use of fraudulent enforcement language, and a pattern of selective enforcement. At this point, it was no longer about the fence. It was about the structure, the way someone like Karen could construct a petty empire using fear, ambiguity, and paperwork. The escalation had begun quietly, almost invisibly, but now it was all surface. Signs, letters, accusations, Each one chipped away not at Jason's confidence, but at the illusion that the community was governed by consensus or common sense. It was a reminder that sometimes the most hostile environments don't arrive with noise and fire. They arrive through silence, regulation, and the slow, suffocating creep of unchecked authority. Jason didn't react with anger or drama. He didn't rally neighbors or launch counter-campaigns. He responded the way a seasoned professional would, by treating it like a system problem, not a personal attack. And in doing so, he triggered something Karen had never anticipated: scrutiny she couldn't control. Because while petty power might rule over a cul-de-sac, it couldn't survive exposure to real rules, real law, and real accountability. And Jason was now moving toward all three. The summer heat settled over the neighborhood like a thick, invisible blanket. It was the kind of heat that silenced birds, slowed dogs to a crawl, and made even the most fastidious gardeners skip their routines. For Jason, it made the quiet of his backyard feel heavier than usual, as if every minute of tension with Karen and the board had soaked into the air itself. His fence, which had once felt like a statement of precision and dignity, now felt like a lightning rod. But it still stood, unbent, unblemished, and that mattered. Every morning he looked at it. He reminded himself that his response had to remain stronger than her provocation. But on the morning he received a letter from the county's Department of Public Facilities, informing him that a formal inspection of communal water safety and infrastructure integrity was scheduled at the community pool. Jason realized the balance of control had finally started to shift, and he hadn't even lifted a finger to make it happen. The letter, delivered through standard county mail and bearing a stamped seal, was not addressed to Jason directly. It had simply been copied to all residents of the development, noting a forthcoming unannounced audit of the public amenities due to an anonymous citizen complaint. Jason hadn't filed it. Martin hadn't either. But someone had. Perhaps another resident emboldened by his quiet resistance. Perhaps a third party who had heard whispers through the bureaucratic pipeline. It didn't matter. The Oversight Board, notified through Martin's complaint and supported by an increasing number of quietly submitted grievances from other residents, had finally begun to investigate. Karen's control had always hinged on the assumption that no one would question her publicly, that her version of rules and governance would pass unchallenged simply because it was dressed in the correct format. But when formal governance arrived, with its real seals and consequences, her system began to show cracks. Jason heard it first in the form of rumor. The neighbor who once crossed the street to avoid him now stopped long enough to murmur, "Did you hear they're shutting the pool for maintenance?" Another, watering her potted ferns, mumbled, "They're saying something about expired safety permits." Karen, for her part, remained visibly stoic. She was still conducting her walks, clipboard in hand, occasionally snapping photos of lawns that didn't meet her nebulous definition of compliance. But her tone had changed. Gone was the sharp confidence in her step. It had been replaced by stiffness, tension held in her shoulders like someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. The day of the inspection came and went without spectacle. Jason didn't attend. He didn't need to. He merely watched from his back porch, sipping cold coffee, as two marked county vehicles pulled up near the community clubhouse. 3 people, one in a maintenance uniform, 2 in button-downs with name tags, entered through the back gate. They spent over 2 hours there. No one from the community was invited to accompany them. No notices were handed out. When they left, they said nothing to the residents. But 2 days later, a laminated sign appeared at the pool entrance, zip-tied to the gate. Closed until further notice. Infrastructure, audit pending. That sign hit the neighborhood like a thunderclap. Karen didn't make a statement. Instead, she sent out an email blast from the community mailing list, vaguely blaming seasonal maintenance cycles and temporary procedural adjustments. But the wording couldn't hide what was really happening. People began whispering. 2 residents confronted her at the walking path, asking about permit expiration dates. Another demanded to know why the pool had failed inspection. For the first time since Jason had moved in, someone other than him was questioning her authority. Not behind closed doors, but openly. The dynamic had shifted. Jason remained silent. He wasn't gloating, and he certainly didn't want to become a local martyr. His entire approach had been to defend his home and dignity without turning the situation into a crusade. But that silence, paradoxically, only made his position stronger. He had done nothing but insist on his right to improve his property legally and respectfully. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't canvassed support. He had simply stood his ground, and now it was Karen who found herself trying to justify her behavior to the community. And yet, just when Jason thought the conflict might begin to settle, another envelope arrived. This time it wasn't from the board or the county. It came directly from a law office. A cease and desist letter accusing Jason of instigating systemic disruption of communal governance and targeting individual members of the community council for reputational damage. The language was grandiose, the claims vague, and nowhere in the letter was Jason accused of any illegal activity. It was a threat masquerading as legal action, clearly authored not for a courtroom, but for intimidation. Jason forwarded the letter to Martin, who responded within the hour. "This is an empty saber," he said over the phone. "They're trying to spook you. The fact that they've resorted to a private attorney now tells me Karen's desperate. She's lost control of the process, and now she's throwing everything she has at the wall to see what sticks." But Jason wasn't rattled. In fact, the letter clarified something he had suspected but hadn't articulated. Karen was afraid. Not of him personally, but of what he represented. A breach in her authority, a demonstration that someone could defy her rules and not be buried under the weight of her system. He had become, unintentionally, a proof of concept for independence, and for someone like Karen, that was the most dangerous kind of rebellion. In the following days, new details began to surface. Sylvia, the former target of Karen's overreach, dropped off a packet at Jason's doorstep. A folder containing copies of internal committee emails she had requested through a public disclosure filing. Buried among the documents was an email thread discussing strategic citations and how certain non-compliant installations should be flagged in early stages to prevent others from getting ideas. Jason's address was mentioned directly. His project had been targeted before it was even complete. Jason didn't feel vindicated. He felt confirmed. Everything he had suspected had now been documented. This wasn't just about a fence. It was about a person who had built her power by controlling the flow of information and using selectively applied policies to punish those who didn't play along. But Karen had made one miscalculation. She assumed that no one would ever push back hard enough to matter. That weekend, Jason took a quiet walk through the neighborhood, not to parade his position, but to reoccupy a space that had tried to push him out. He passed by the now locked pool gate, the laminated sign fluttering slightly in the breeze. A group of teenagers stood nearby, disappointed and confused. "I thought they fixed it already," one said. Another added, "My mom said it's because they didn't fill out the inspection forms for, years." Jason kept walking, hands in his pockets, the voices fading behind him. He wasn't sure what would come next. Karen still had allies. The board, while rattled, hadn't disbanded. But what was now undeniable was that her grip was loosening, and that grip had been the backbone of her power. Without it, she was just another neighbor, one whose decisions were finally being judged not by her interpretation of the rules, but by the rules themselves. And in that quiet collapse, Jason found the first real moment of peace since the day he received his first violation notice. The war wasn't over, but the field had changed. And this time, the rules weren't just being written by one person with a clipboard. The late summer sun had begun to lose its glare, slanting longer afternoons and casting sweeping shadows across Jason's backyard, but the tension he felt was undiminished, instead embedding itself deeper into his daily existence as if every lucid moment of calm carried a silent question: when would the next blow land? In the days following the forced closure of the community pool and the beginning of external scrutiny, the neighborhood had shifted. Relationships grew taut with avoidance and suspicion. The manicured streets and trimmed hedges became the backdrop to a hushed conflict. Jason's glass fence, once a symbol of meticulous control and tasteful design, now stood as a flashpoint. Its presence was an affront, not because it was unsafe or illegal, but because it had been constructed without deference to the power structure personified by Karen. And she, having seen her usual methods fail to compel him, had escalated. It started subtly, with anonymous drops. A carefully folded flyer on his doorstep with bold red ink accusing him of destroying neighborhood unity. A glass jar filled with mud labeled reflection material taped to the gate, and a morning paper, altered to include a ranting editorial about outsiders flaunting unilateral decisions. Each delivery bore the signature of intent without responsibility. Jason cataloged and time-stamped every piece, then forwarded Heart of Darkness composites to Martin, who responded with calm acknowledgement and strategic suggestions on recording and preserving evidence. It was not fear that enveloped Jason, but awareness. He understood this was psychological pressure intended to feel invasive without inciting legal claim. The grams of mental disruption they carried, however, were real. Meanwhile, tensions advanced in the legal domain. A missive from the committee's legal representatives arrived, labeling Jason's fence as intruding into common space and presenting significant implications for the cohesive community aesthetic. It demanded immediate removal, threatening to file liens and recoup legal costs. Despite its captured urgency, the language remained opaque. Neither the location of encroachment nor a clearly published rule was referenced. Jason sent the entire package to Martin, along with all building plans, property surveys, and city permits, asking his attorney to reply with a form-backed rebuttal and a public request for evidence that justified the alleged encroachment. Martin obliged with precision, knowing that forcing transparency could unravel Karen's clandestine enforcement. The firm responded again, escalating with an invitation for a private conflict resolution discussion. Jason instructed that they would attend, but only in a formal mediated session with legal oversight and public accountability. Social currents shifted too. Distance grew among neighbors. Greg, who once nodded at Jason in aisles, now crossed the street to avoid him. Sylvia, who had shared her own confrontations, tightened her lips when passing in the morning. A home's porch light that once glowed in welcome now flickered unlit. Jason received his invitation to the late August neighborhood festival, a community mixer, yet quietly refused, opting to stay away with plausible domestic duties. Karen's reply, terse and handled by a third party, indicated his absence had been noted. The message was implicit. He was no longer welcome. Jason recognized this as precisely what Karen intended. She wished to isolate him, to amplify the sense that if he didn't comply, he would be alone. Yet every apparent loss he documented became evidence of method, not misstep. He maintained a digital folder of all communications, anonymous flyers, legal correspondence, community email threads, and screenshots from forums discussing the matter. When the private attorney suggested the fence was unilateral and damaging to communal sentiments, Martin replied via official channels that the fence was within Jason's property bounds, legally permitted and consistent with previously approved installations in other nearby homes, all of which had not triggered any notices. He requested clause-by-clause references to support their claims. The attorney responded with a request for mediation, which Jason agreed to on the condition of transparency and observation, clearly noting in his letter that he would attend with counsel and would welcome observers or community members at the mediation session. The offer was accepted. Just as the mediation bore signs of success, a final act of intimidation emerged. A typed notice placed under his windshield wiper, asserting that his utility services would be discontinued due to unresolved compliance matters. The letter mimicked official billing notices, account numbers, deadlines, procedural codes, but the utility provider confirmed there was no such filing. Recognizing this as intimidation via confusion, Jason forwarded the photo to Martin, who advised him to include it in their public submission and highlight it to oversight authorities as an attempt at fraudulent scare tactics. Jason then posted a redacted version on a specialized online forum, soliciting input from community governance experts, who identified it as resembling an unlicensed homeowner-generated intimidation template. Jason archived the input. Throughout these developments, his fence remained intact and unchallenged physically. What was assaulted was his reputation and sense of belonging. He began discreet discussions with other homeowners who had quietly received reports or paperwork. A few confirmed that they'd received notices similar in tone to Jason's, though they lacked standing to contest them. He secured written statements from the pool maintenance team affirming that their certifications and permits were in compliance. Documents he later included in a summary circulated to the community mailing list, not as accusation, but as factual context. The cumulative weight of documentation demonstrated that his case wasn't singular, but symptomatic. The silent enforcement of invisible rules through intimidation, legal mimicry, and social marginalization. All of this came to a head on the day of the mediation session. Jason joined with Martin present, ready. Karen participated through her legal representative, professional, and tense. The mediator, a retired adjudicator with formal credentials, required recordings and notes to be available. The session began with claims that the fence was out of aesthetic coherence and improperly installed. Martin produced Jason's survey, property plans, city permits, and publicly accessible community rules, and requested documented evidence of any zoning violation. As Karen's attorney floundered without published code, Martin methodically introduced findings. Other comparable fences within the community had not triggered notices. The county's oversight board was investigating the committee's patterns, and anonymous intimidation tactics had been reported. With careful articulation, Martin framed the issue as a governance failure. Opaque rules, selective enforcement, and privately enforced intimidation. The mediator paused, then recommended immediate dismissal of the accusations regarding the fence, required the fence remain, and advised a community-wide policy audit. The session ended with constraints. Any further threats or intimidation must be halted or risk formal challenge. That evening, the community seemed to exhale as rain washing away dust. Texts arrived from neighbors. Quiet, appreciative acknowledgments. Greg finally allowed a small smile. Sylvia left a congratulations note on his porch. And though Jason felt little satisfaction, he glimpsed a glimmer of restored normalcy. People were learning that peace did not rely on silence, and unity did not require uniformity. As the sun was low in the sky, he stepped out and placed his hand against the surface of his fence, feeling the cool strength of tempered glass and quiet resolve. Here it was, unbroken, proof that authority without transparency collapses under scrutiny, and that quiet, persistent resistance can reclaim control when fear is the currency of power. As September wore on and the early shadows of autumn began to settle over the once manicured calm of the neighborhood, a kind of unspoken stalemate gripped the streets. The air carried less tension now, but it was not peace. It was the cold weight of unfinished business. The mediation session had ended with Jason's legal vindication, the false violation officially dissolved, and Karen's authority finally tethered to external scrutiny. But something deeper had shifted. The neighborhood had tasted the real face of its governance, the fear, the secrecy, the manipulation beneath the surface. And that revelation did not dissipate easily. Jason knew the public victory had changed the power dynamic, but he also knew that people like Karen did not accept defeat with grace. And, true to form, she wasn't done yet. It began subtly. Again. That was always Karen's way. There were no more fake notices, no illegal letters, no obvious escalation. Instead, she turned to procedure. At the next quarterly board meeting, an item appeared at the bottom of the agenda titled simply, Special Administrative Proposal, Fence and Perimeter Review Criteria. Jason wasn't on the invite list, nor was the item explained in detail. But someone forwarded it to him anyway, a neighbor anonymously, slipping a printed copy into his mailbox with a single note. She's trying again. The wording was vague but ominous, and Jason knew exactly what it meant. If she couldn't force him to take down the fence through pseudo-legal tactics, she would try to rewrite the rules around it, create a framework so narrowly defined that his fence, and perhaps others like it, would be outlawed retroactively. Jason brought the matter directly to Martin, who confirmed the risk. If the new proposal passed, even if not enforceable retroactively, Karen could create enough regulatory confusion to make life hell again. Appeal boards, conditional fines, community votes. Bureaucracy wielded like a knife. The most dangerous weapon wasn't noise, it was silence hidden in process. But Martin had anticipated this move. He helped Jason draft a formal challenge under the state's property governance transparency laws, which required that any proposed regulatory changes affecting homeowner rights be publicized with sufficient notice and made accessible for review. Karen had failed to do that. Once again, she had tried to govern in the dark. Jason submitted the challenge directly to the county, and within 3 days, the board was served with a compliance inquiry demanding documentation of the policy change proposal, its circulation records, and a complete transcript of its board discussion. Under pressure, the committee postponed the vote. Karen sent out an email blaming technical miscommunication and promising full transparency in future processes. But it was clear the blow had landed. Still, Jason knew it was a temporary retreat. And then, in an unexpected twist that finally shifted the ground beneath her feet completely, the County Oversight Board's Infrastructure Division published their findings. The report was dense, 32 pages long, but its conclusions were impossible to ignore. The community pool had operated without renewed safety inspections for over 4 years, and though it was still structurally sound, its maintenance logs had been falsified twice. The person listed as the supervising maintenance reviewer, Karen Lowry. In 3 separate entries, her signature appeared next to maintenance certification dates that didn't match the technician logs provided by the service company. It wasn't criminal yet. It would need further investigation, but it was damning. The report recommended the pool remain closed indefinitely until full inspection and recertification, and all certification duties be reassigned pending formal inquiry. Jason hadn't expected vindication to come so clearly. He hadn't submitted the complaint. He hadn't even known about the technician logs. But the system she used to quietly dominate the neighborhood had exposed itself through its own arrogance. The final pillar of her reputation, the belief that she was simply doing her duty to preserve the neighborhood's excellence, was now fractured by suspicion of negligence and falsification. Within a week, 2 more board members resigned quietly. No public letters, no declarations, just quiet departures. One of them left a manila folder on Jason's porch with no note inside. just 3 years' worth of internal emails, some authored by Karen, discussing policy enforcement strategies, complaints, and personal notes about specific residents' non-compliance temperaments. Jason scanned the documents and turned them over to Martin, who flagged at least 4 statements that could be interpreted as targeted harassment. There would be no lawsuit from Jason, no grandstanding, but the file was now in the right hands. Then came the moment that brought it all full circle. Jason received an envelope, official, from the newly interim board chair. It contained a formal notice. The pool would remain closed pending a county-led audit. Karen Lowry had voluntarily stepped back from all board duties, and a temporary committee was being formed to review all past enforcement cases over the previous 5 years for possible reversal or compensation. Jason sat at his kitchen table, the letter open before him, hands still. He didn't smile. He didn't pour a drink. He simply stared at the letter and finally exhaled, not with triumph, but with closure. What he had endured had never truly been about offense. It had always been about principle, about what happens when authority is left unchecked in the hands of someone who confuses power with entitlement. His resistance hadn't been loud or dramatic. It had been steady, rational, relentless in its clarity. He had demanded transparency, legality, and respect. And through those demands he had dismantled a system built on intimidation. That evening, as twilight stretched over the neighborhood and the empty pool stood silent behind chained gates, Jason walked the perimeter of his backyard, tracing the smooth edge of the fence that had started it all. The glass was still clean, the bolts tight, the anchors sound. It had endured storms, attacks, and bureaucratic siege, and it remained untouched. A quiet monument to boundaries, not just physical, but personal. And for the first time in months, Jason felt the weight lift, not because the fight was over, but because he no longer needed to fight at all. Oh, the weeks that followed passed with a kind of heavy calm that felt unfamiliar, like waking up in a house after a long storm and realizing the silence isn't fragile anymore. It's earned. For the first time since Jason had moved into the neighborhood, his mornings were quiet not because of tension, but because they could be. There were no new letters on his door, no anonymous notes, no bureaucratic notices hidden beneath legal pretenses. The neighborhood, still recovering from its long exposure to the consequences of unchecked authority, had fallen into a hushed reflection. Lawns were still mowed. Trash was still collected. But something in the air had shifted permanently. An invisible power structure had fractured, and its absence made everything quieter in a different, deeper way. Karen was gone. Not physically. Her house still stood 3 streets over, curtains always drawn, driveway mostly empty, but her role had evaporated. She no longer walked with a clipboard or gave those low, tight-lipped nods to neighbors. Or she no longer sent messages to the committee or posted agenda items. The new interim board chair had taken over quietly, without ceremony. Meetings were now recorded and published. Policy changes required actual input, and though no one said it aloud, everyone understood that the silence surrounding Karen was not neutrality. It was the space created when a person who had misused power could no longer hide behind it. Jason didn't involve himself in the committee's recovery process. He didn't run for office, didn't volunteer, didn't give interviews or statements. He simply lived. He trimmed his hedges, replaced one of the underwater lights in the pool, and installed 2 small outdoor speakers along the path. He played jazz some evenings, not loud enough to bother anyone, just enough to accompany the movement of water and light. The fence, his fence, remained unbothered, unchallenged, unchanged. It stood not just as a victory, but as a marker of something deeper, that when resistance is patient, principled, and consistent, it becomes undeniable, even to those who want it erased. A few of the neighbors began to reconnect. Greg, the retired mechanic who once turned his back, stopped by with a six-pack of beer one Friday evening, unannounced but not unwelcome. "Hell of a time," he muttered, sitting down on the edge of the deck without waiting for an invitation. They talked about the drainage system, lawn chemicals, the cost of outdoor timers. Nothing deep, nothing emotional, but the presence alone was acknowledgement enough. 2 days later, a woman from 3 houses down knocked to ask if Jason could recommend someone for outdoor lighting installation. He gave her a name and a warning. Make sure the permit is visible, just in case. The pool remained closed, the padlocked gate a kind of scar. Visible, inescapable, but healing. A sign now hung there not in laminate, but in thick, mounted acrylic. Closed for county review. The board planned to renovate it eventually, but the timeline was indefinite, and no one seemed to mind. It had been, after all, more symbol than amenity. And now, its silence spoke more clearly than ever before. It reminded everyone that governance, if left to fester in backrooms and quiet vendettas, would eventually expose its own rot. Jason walked past the pool sometimes, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. He didn't stop. He didn't stare. He simply passed by, the way you pass a place you once lived but no longer belonged to. Not out of exile, but evolution. He had outlasted it. He had returned every attack not with fire, but with fact, and in doing so had changed the terrain. By mid-October, the community had shifted. There were fewer meetings, fewer arguments. More homeowners had begun to attend forums, and one of the newer residents even circulated a proposal to establish an external audit every 2 years for committee operations. Karen's name hadn't appeared in a document since her recusal, but her shadow still lingered, a reminder of how fragile autonomy becomes when residents stop paying attention. The lesson wasn't in her fall. It was in the silence that had let her rise. Jason didn't reflect much on the ordeal. Not anymore. He didn't need to. The outcome wasn't about recognition or revenge. It was about reclaiming peace and keeping it. The fence still stood, same as before. It hadn't changed shape, hadn't shifted or cracked. And neither had he. And though no one would say it out loud, many understood something they hadn't before. That real resilience is quiet, methodical, and persistent. Not dramatic, not loud, but absolutely immovable. And sometimes it's the one thing that outlasts everything else.